All right, piss and vinegar day 199, push day. So chest, triceps, shoulders, doing both arms today. There's going to be an obvious difference in strength, but yeah, today I want to talk about when you shouldn't do high intensity or when you should start doing high intensity. So there is a time and place for high intensity, and it's not always. Novices and beginners probably shouldn't do high intensity for a myriad of reasons. The biggest reason being that you don't actually need that much intensity to make adaptations anyway because you're so fresh to training, and thus you are better off training with reps in reserve, getting the same result that you would get if you took it to failure, and then being permitted to train more frequently because you're not putting as much of a strain on your central nervous system. When you take a bench press to failure, you need at least 4 or 5 days rest before you can bench press again. But if you take that same bench press and have 2 or 3 reps in reserve, you could probably bench press 2 days later. And the difference being, when you're a novice, that set of 5x5 with reps in reserve will give you the exact same result as the set that you did with absolute intensity to failure because you're so unadapted, you don't need that much intensity of effort to make adaptations. So not only do you not need that much, it then allows you to train more frequently. Rather than getting, say, 52 bench press sessions in a year, you get 150 or you get 200 because you're training or you're bench pressing twice or 3 times a week in the first 6 months to a year of being a novice, which equates to more gains. And also, you need to get the neurological adaptations out of the way. So when you aren't neurologically adapted to a movement, it's like riding a bike. You might be able to get on that bike without training wheels all of a sudden, but you still can't go super fast. Your musculature has the ability to go really fast, but your coordination and neurology doesn't, and the technique is not there. So no matter how how strong you are, you can't output that force into the bike because you haven't made the neurological adaptations or the technical prowess yet to do it. Same thing with the bench press. You might have the ability to bench press 55 kilos for 8 reps to failure, but you might only be able to bench press 40 kilos for 8 reps to failure because your body is unable to recruit every motor neuron with efficiency, and thus you don't even get to recruit every fiber. So training one set to failure would be pretty much useless anyway. I mean, not useless, granted, but you're not going to be getting the same benefit from someone who's neurologically adapted, who can actually recruit every fiber efficiently and then safely. I mean, when you first start training, good luck taking a bench press to failure with any reasonable weight relative to your strength level and making it look like a decently safe bench press. When you start failing, you're going to be shaking uncontrollably because you don't have the coordination, you don't have the stabilization muscles yet. Your tendons and ligaments are not ready for that kind of stimulus. And thus, you won't even be able to train to failure correctly relative to what you can output otherwise. So hopefully that makes sense. There's a bunch of other reasons. Yeah, mainly the big one being safety, actually, now that I think about it. I mean, gains aside, you get gains from just about anything when you first start, but what's the safest way to start? You don't want to start your lifting career with injury. And, people will think about starting their lifting year as the first time they lift a weight. You could be technically starting 2 years in because you've just been doing shit so wrong. I've seen people in the gym who've been training for 2 years and they technically haven't gotten any strength, so they may as well still be a beginner. And if I was to then say, hey, try this program, they would then basically be starting from square one because then they'd actually be progressing. But you don't want to be taking sets to failure when you first start. You're not going to be able to do it safely, and it won't be as useful as reps in reserve. So don't get me wrong. Yes, I'm a high intensity advocate, but there is a time and place for high intensity. Now, in saying this, if you are a novice or a beginner and you really like the idea of high intensity because you're lazy, you don't like working out, and you don't want to spend 3 to 4 to 5, maybe even hours a week in the gym doing volume training, because when you first start, you'll be training the most you've ever trained. When you're training 3 times a week, full body 5x5, and the sessions are taking an hour and a half to 2 hours, that's a fucking very long session, especially for someone that doesn't have the work capacity yet or the habit yet that would be enjoyable. I habitually work out. If you forced me to do a 5x5 novice program for some reason, I wouldn't do it because it's just fucking boring, even habit aside. So if you're lazy and you find volume boring, or maybe you just don't have much time, then yeah, you can start with high intensity training. You just have to be careful. You would have to start by doing reps and reserves, for example. Rather than doing that bench press to failure, you would do one set with, a rep or reserve there, and that would still suffice. You would still get progress. You'd still make gains because you're so unadapted. And then over time, you slowly progress up to the point where you are going to mechanical failure. And it would depend on the movement. Deadlifts, you probably wouldn't want to go to mechanical failure for quite some time, if ever, in some people's cases. Whereas, for example, a tricep extension, pretty safe to take a tricep extension to failure pretty early on. If you're, 2 to 3 months into training, you could probably realistically start taking sets to failure. But if it's a heavy compound movement, maybe not so much. I'd also highly suggest doing super slow methods. So doing, 5 to 10 second rep periods. So on the eccentric, you take 5 seconds to lift it up on the bench press, and on the negative, you would then use 5 seconds to do that. That way, you take talking forces off your connective tissues that are slightly underdeveloped or quite undeveloped because you haven't been training for very long. And then also technique is involved. So use super slow technique, use primarily machine. If you have a bench press variation that you could do on a machine, that's going to be significantly more ideal because you won't have to then stabilize, and it's a fixed pattern movement. Rather than doing a squat, do a leg press. I mean, a lot of these movements are better even if you're an advanced trainer, because high intensity is just done safer with machines. You can also feel your muscles better with machines versus your, stabilizers or ligaments, etc. So I'd highly suggest using machines, using the super slow method, going very, very slow, and not going to failure too quickly, because you don't necessarily even need failure training. But if you do have the time and you do have the motivation, start with volume first, and then 6 to 12 months down the line, when you have got your linear, adaptation, linear gains or your neurological adaptations out of the way, then switch to high intensity training. There are other cases of high intensity training not being entirely efficient for people. If you have a risk of stroke, for example, if you have maybe a benign tumor in your head or something that would potentially give you a stroke if you were to massively exert yourselves, then high intensity training is probably not the way to go. You're probably going to want to look at like high reps, blood flow restricted training, get the most out of little weight as possible. Or if you're incredibly old, like if you're 80, 90 years old, probably don't want to be taking sets to failure. And at that point, you could still do one set and just have reps in reserve. You won't need that much volume at that age. You're not going to be building that much muscle anyway at that point, unless you're on testosterone replacement therapy. So there are some contexts. If you have a brain injury, or if you have, like you're just really fucking old and your joints and tendons and ligaments just can't take heavy stimuluses beyond failure. But again, that's where the super slow method and the slow, machine work comes into play. You can still take failure safely if you're doing everything slow and controlled, whereas volume will oftentimes induce, faster rep speed, which can then in turn give you joint ligament, tendon, and injuries, etc. So if you're really old or you have a brain injury, maybe not so much either. If you are a power lifter, I wouldn't highly suggest it, because you want to be training with a lot of frequency for powerlifting, because it's a sport-specific sport, but it happens to be through, or sports specificity comes into play, but the sport itself requires you to lift weights. So unlike sprinting, for example, where when you want to get good at sprinting, you have to sprint, which is not a weightlifting exercise. It's a weight-bearing exercise, but it's outside of that, so you can recover then by lifting weights at the same time. But in powerlifting, you have to literally do a bunch of volume and frequency to get the neurological adaptations and the skill acquisition. So if you're a powerlifter, high intensity might not be the best bet, unless you're doing like a program that doesn't require that much, frequency. So like, say for example, you're doing a push day once a week. You could do your volume bench press, do 4 sets of 6, and then your speed work of 3 sets of 8 or whatever it is. Sorry, 8 sets of 3 rather, and then follow up with the accessories to failure, because the bench press is what you're trying to train to get neurological adaptations and skill acquisition in. But then everything else is an accessory. The incline bench, the tricep extension, these movements are just simply build more mass and strength in said area, so that you can then output more into the skill of the bench press. So if you're a powerlifter, you could make your accessories high intensity so long as you weren't training frequently. If you then followed that push day up with a bench press, another push day, say 3 days later, you would not be recovered, because you would have taken your central nervous system to fatigue from that high intensity accessory work. But if you are training with a lack of frequency, maybe you're just training push pull legs once a week each, yeah, make your accessories high intensity. It's a significantly quicker way of doing powerlifting training because powerlifting training can take a long time. If you're doing 10 sets on your bench press, 10 sets on your squats, and 10 sets on your deadlifts, that's going to take anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour. And then you're doing your accessories, of which you're doing 3 sets, 4 sets of 8 to 12, depending on the program. If it's a power building program, you have even more volume. Whereas if you just focus on the skill acquisition stuff at the start, the squat, the bench, the deadlift, with all these sets, and then follow up the accessories with high intensity, not only will you likely build more muscle because high intensity is much better at building pure muscular mass versus neurological adaptations, you're going to be better recovered and you're going to spend less time in the gym. So that's another thing is if you are doing powerlifting, it is optional. You possibly can do high intensity. You just have to modulate your training a little bit. Strongman, that's another one where you definitely can't be doing high intensity training because all you're doing is skill acquisition on every single lift because there's so many different variants of lifts. You're really just trying to get very technical at it because these guys, are super strong. It's not that hard. They can the stones that they lift, for example, aren't that heavy relative to their strength level, but the technical prowess required to lift that, or an Olympic lifter is an even better example. The technical prowess required for Olympic lifting is incredible. Hence why these guys train on a daily basis. They train on all day, half the time with like sort of a Bulgarian method, and the reason for this is that they need to get better skill-wise at lift, not necessarily strength. They do strength training, but they train too frequently to be doing high intensity training. High intensity training requires more rest. So there's for sure times where high intensity will not be for you. But in saying that, if you're doing another sport, like say for example rugby, where you want to be spending less time in the gym, and spending more time on skill acquisition by kicking the ball or doing lineouts or whatever your specific role entails, if you can spend more time on the field actually doing skill acquisition, then you're going to acquire more skill. But the more time you spend in the gym, not only are you taking away from your recovery and then increasing injury risk, you're then taking away from your skill acquisition. So if you're just simply trying to build pure contractile strength and pure muscle mass for your sport that doesn't require lifting weights as the sport specific thing itself, like powerlifting, like strongman, then you're better off doing high intensity in a lot of cases. You would think that an athlete requires power work. For example, if you're a sprinter, you should work on your ability to explode through your box squat or something. But this is a fallacy. You just simply, power comes from strength. If you're stronger, then you just need to become more efficient, and the efficiency comes from the sport-specific work that you do on the field, which in this case would be sprinting. That's your skill acquisition. You build the strength through metrics, progressive overload, and then you get better at sprinting, and you combine those two things, and you become more explosive. You don't do box squats or box jumps or these plyometric injury-prone exercises that tear down your ligaments and tendons and then give you a shorter career in your sport to get stronger. You do strength training in a slow, controlled manner, and high-intensity training is great for that because you don't have to spend as much time in the gym. In a lot of contexts, you would think high intensity wouldn't work, but ultimately there is a workaround. And I mean, I think the only one that I really know of is Olympic lifting and strongman, where high intensity training wouldn't work. But just about every other sport, not only would it work, a lot of times it'd actually be superior. And they're actually giving NFL athletes nowadays a lot of times high intensity protocols for this exact reason. They are having less injuries based off the fact that they aren't training so much in the weight room. They're not doing this fluff and pump volume that's just working beyond their capacity that they don't need to be working on. They didn't need 8 sets of squats per workout. They only needed 1, you know what I mean? Or they didn't even necessarily need a squat because a squat is risk adverse, whereas they could have just purely worked on their quadriceps output on a leg press in a safer manner, and a manner that's super standardized and in that way you're metrically actually getting strong honestly. So I'm a huge advocate for high intensity in just about every goal imaginable. Even if you wanted to be an endurance athlete, strength is never a weakness, and if you're not in a huge calorie surplus, just purely increasing the strength of your legs will allow you to run longer. If you can leg press 100 kilos and then you want to run 50 kilometers, it's going to be significantly easier to run 50 kilometers if you then were the same person but you could leg press 300 kilos, because your legs are now technically 3 to 6 times stronger than they were before, which then increases endurance, even if your cardio and your lung capacity isn't increased. So this video was gonna. I kind of wanted to make this video about what doesn't work in a high intensity context. But now I'm just thinking about this. I've basically illuminated the fact that most context high intensity works very well. Only that of beginners does it not make a hell of a lot of sense, and powerlifters and strongmen. So, yeah, if you are, and even then, if you're a beginner, you could still make high intensity training work. And if you're a strongman, you could probably still make it work. I mean, I'd imagine that, let's say, for example, you are a strongman. 1 week you do a high intensity training session to increase your pure contractile strength through incredibly standardized, non-technical ways. And then the next week you do a shit ton of skill acquisition without a hell of a lot of load. You might find a bunch of results from that, because one of the biggest problems of strongmen is overtraining and injuries. These guys are getting injured all the fucking time, and part of that is, these are guys are 6'10", fucking 200 kilos with abs. Like, shit's gonna blow off the bone eventually when you're that guy. But it also might be that they're just constantly doing these skill acquisition volume workouts. Whereas if they just took a deload week where they just focus on the muscles with like a super slow method and put less emphasis on the central nervous system and the tendons, maybe they get results. This is something that I've been sort of trying with arm wrestling training, where I've been just trying to see where I could get with arm wrestling training with high intensity. 1 set to failure, once a week on my forearm exercises. I've yet to even arm wrestle, an amateur arm wrestle, but I'm very curious for the day where I do, to see where I stand by just simply increasing the vectors of strength that are, good for arm wrestling in a high intensity context. And that way, maybe, if you just train high intensity training once a week, then you could probably do more table time in in an arm wrestling context, because you're more recovered. Whereas if you're lifting weights 3 to 4 times a week, then you try to get on the table, you're probably going to be broken down and not get as much out of it. So, sports context, high intensity makes sense a lot of times, and I don't think it's been used enough until recently. We're starting to see more and more people using high intensity in a sport context, and I'm very curious to see what happens with different sports teams who have switched to high intensity, but also different athletes. And who knows? I'd like to see some genetic beast in arm wrestling specifically, because arm wrestling, I haven't really seen anyone that takes the 1 set to failure approach except for myself, and I am not genetically gifted in arm wrestling. I have very small hands, and it's just not really my passion. So I don't know if I could ever really be competitive. But someone who could be competitive, I'd be very curious to see what would happen if they just did high intensity training. And it's funny, because there is actually one person who essentially did 1 set to failure, or a lot of sets to failure, but 1 high intensity session once a week in arm wrestling, who is considered the best of all time, and that's John Brzenk. He's notorious for not doing any weights and not doing for that much frequency. He would just go to the arm wrestling practice table, of which you were technically training to failure all the fucking time when you arm wrestle on the table. He'd do that for a few hours, and then he would just do it again next week, or maybe do it twice a week. But realistically, he was doing high intensity training, unbelievably recovered, generally never really suffered an injury. He had some shoulder issues, which might have been unrelated, but other than that, he's been pretty injury free. He's got incredible longevity rather, and he's considered the greatest arm wrestler of all time. So it'd be cool to see what would happen if someone did what he did, but in a weights context. Just did weights once a week, high intensity training, and then maybe did table time the next week or something like that, and see where it goes. This video has gone a little bit off topic, but I don't know. I can't just keep talking about what high intensity doesn't work for fucking damn near 22 minutes, because it turns out it works for a lot of things. But anyway, it's kind of gone into a sports specific context now. But yeah, I mean, really, at the end of the day, unless you're a novice or a beginner, you could probably do high intensity. And even if you are a novice or a beginner, you could probably do high intensity and get a hell of a lot of benefits out of it. The only other time I could imagine high intensity not making sense is if you just really enjoy training, a lot. If you like training every single day for 2 to 3 hours, like I used to as a teenager, and I used to train to failure too, which is funny. But if you really like training all the fucking time, then yeah, don't do high intensity, because you won't be able to recover from it. If you want to train 6 days a week and you want to, train for 3 hours and do a shit ton of volume, you can't then equally take everything to failure, because it's just overtrained. So if you really fucking love the gym, then yeah, maybe switch to volume, because high intensity won't allow you to train for that long. You can't do a, hour and a half high intensity session. I mean, you can, but you won't get the same results as if you did it for a significantly less time, with significantly less volume, with significantly less frequency. So if you really fucking love the gym, then don't do high intensity. Do volume, and potentially you get less results though. But other than that, high intensity rules. Everyone else rules. I think I'm going to leave it there for today. I think there's like another minute of this video to go. I've kind of fucking ran out of shit to talk about. So, peace out. Bye.